¿Qué va a pasar el resto de la tarde? Pues vamos a tener distintos conversatorios, vamos a tener la posibilidad también con distintos exponentes y referentes del sector empresarial de toda Centroamérica de escuchar justamente testimonios y distintas opiniones que realmente son importantes. Así es que participen, será muy bueno poder escuchar y poder leer todos esos comentarios que ustedes tienen que hacer a través de las redes sociales. Ya estamos casi listos para poder arrancar y para darle continuidad a este momento importante. La primera conferencia, la primera exposición de esta tarde, vamos a hablar de todas las oportunidades y de todos los retos para la región centroamericana con esta importante exposición. Debemos recordar y agradecer, por supuesto, a todos los patrocinadores que han permitido que este segundo diálogo empresarial se pueda realizar de esta manera, haciendo un recordatorio, haciendo un repaso de lo que ocurría exactamente hace un año, cuando teníamos la oportunidad de compartir con todos ustedes este primer diálogo donde distintas personalidades de la empresa y del sector industrial de toda Centroamérica pudieron participar hablando y exponiendo y sobre todo haciendo propuestas concretas. El año 2020 no fue un año fácil para todos los sectores, pero específicamente para el sector comercial, y es por eso que se reinventaron y se pusieron muchísimos puntos sobre la mesa para poder lanzar estos conceptos tan importantes. Pues este año seguimos en esta tarea, seguimos con la intención fundamental de poder compartir todo esto con ustedes. Vamos a conocer un poco más de nuestros patrocinadores y en instantes sí la conferencia.
Thank you very much. I am dialing in from Washington, and as you can tell, despite having gone through a pandemic for 2 years, we still don't quite have all the connectivity issues completely worked out. So thank you for being patient and for bearing with me. I would be happy to have the opportunity now to offer some thoughts to really kick off what promises to be a very important conversation today that you all are leading. First of all, let me thank you again for the invitation, but also to congratulate you, CACIF, ANEP, COHEP, FUSADES, Fundesa, leading organizations in Central America working together to try to improve the lives of the people of the region. Such an important symbolic effort, but more than just symbolism, really impacting people's lives in a very meaningful way. So congratulations for that, and thank you for your efforts. I also want to congratulate the people of Honduras for free and fair and peaceful elections on Sunday. And I understand COHEP and the United States State Department and others have congratulated Honduras already and the Honduran people. And we look forward to working closely with the new president, the president-elect and her team to really try to achieve the goals of prosperity and to also help with regional integration, development, and to reduce some of the issues that have held back development across the region on the security side and also on the corruption side. So we look forward to working together in that very important capacity. I have to say, what the Honduran people have just done contrasts markedly with what happened on November 7 just next door in Nicaragua, and shows and contrasts the difference when a people are really able to select their own leaders versus when a system is created where they are unable to actually select their own leaders. And I have to say, Nicaragua's descent into a full consolidated dictatorship is clearly a setback, not just for the Nicaraguan people and not just for Central America, but for Latin America and I would say North Americans together. And you know, this is where I want to begin my comments because it wasn't always supposed to be this way. I first started my career at the US Department of State in 1990, and we remember the sense of optimism that came from the Nicaraguan people in the elections of 1990 that were free and fair and led to the election of Violeta Chamorro. We remember with great happiness, really, with great joy, the peace that came to El Salvador in 1992, the peace process that led to the culmination of the signing of the peace accords in Guatemala in 1996. I was privileged to be part of the White House delegation to the signing of the Guatemalan peace accords in 1996. I was there in the National Cathedral. I remember the sense of joy, the palpable sense of relief that after years of conflict, peace had finally come, not just to Guatemala, but also then to the entire region. And the sense of optimism, the sense of hope was extremely important. And it led to those of us in Washington to view Central America in a new way, less as a threat and more as an opportunity, but nonetheless a region that would need help from the United States and other interested parties for some time to come. And so at the first Summit of the Americas in Miami in 1994, again, I was privileged to participate as part of the White House delegation. There was one sub-regional agreement that was signed at the Summit of the Americas in 1994. It was an agreement between the United States and the countries of Central America. It was called the Concausa Agreement. It was designed specifically to be an environmental agreement, but there was one line in there that was a very important line, and it's committed the United States to working with Central America on trade preferences to provide opportunities for Central Americans to trade more effectively with the United States. This was on a unilateral basis. But my point is that in the 1990s, the United States recognized that it would be trade and not aid that would be to the long-term benefit of our region together, that would help sustainable development and help the people of Central America and the United States to achieve their highest aspirations. That, of course, led in the first part of this century to the conclusion of the CAFTA-DR, the Central America Free Trade Agreement that included the Dominican Republic as well. And today, the CAFTA-DR remains the operative trade agreement between the region and the United States. What a great success at the time that it was. But CAFTA-DR was designed to help unify Central America into one unified economic space, to build competitiveness among the region, to guarantee access to the United States market, to draw investment from the United States and frankly elsewhere as well, that would create jobs in the formal economy, that would lead to a reduction in the desire perhaps to migrate to the United States or elsewhere, and to really try to build the region in a manner that I think everybody was hoping to achieve. The problem is, ladies and gentlemen, if I can say, the CAFTA-DR has not lived up to its potential, either from the US perspective or, if I can say, from Central America over the past 20 years. In some way, that's a result of many different things. During the negotiations itself, the United States did not allow in complete free trade from the region. We restricted some products that the region is very competitive in, for example, sugar and other agriculture products that hampered, that created difficulties for Central American exporters to export to the US market. So there were some particularly sensitive sectors that were not fully opened up, which has proven to be a detriment to regional development. But there were other things that have occurred as well. And one is, I have to say, despite the very obvious coordination among regional private sectors right now, nonetheless, over the last 20 years, the countries of Central America, particularly the parties to the CAFTA-DR agreement, have not worked in concert in a way that would create a consciousness of a regional economy as opposed to 5 or 6 or 7 separate economies. And so that's something that I think we need to work together on as well. It has to be said that crime and violence has increased as well. Some of that is linked to the drug trade coming out of Venezuela and other places. But the truth is foreign investors do not like to go to places that are physically insecure. So that has to be something that is also acknowledged and recognized. And clearly, as when we talk about crime, we also have to raise the topic of corruption. Of course, there are some natural disasters that hit the region, Hurricanes George and Mitch and others subsequent to that are nobody's fault, but have had catastrophic implications for the regional development. And then the final thing I would say is that the region itself does not exist in a vacuum. There is a whole global competitiveness agenda that has to be recognized, particularly in the 20 years of CAFTA-DR. That's been the time when China has risen extremely quickly and has proven to be a formidable global competitor. And so the competition has shifted in some ways very, very rapidly. So if we take all of these things together, we see that the promise that many of us felt and have worked for since going back to the end of the wars in the 1990s has not necessarily been achieved. It's not for a lack of trying. Many good people of goodwill, particularly those on this call, have engaged for many years, but somehow we have to find a new approach and do better. And so for the few minutes remaining, I want to suggest a couple things that we might be able to do together to go forward and build the sort of agenda and the sort of results that I think all of us are hoping to achieve. As part of that, as all of you know, the Biden administration in the United States entered office with a very high prioritization of Central America, and particularly the countries it calls the Northern Triangle, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, as a means to focus and build a real agenda for development, focusing on what they call the root causes of limited development that create incentives for people to try to migrate north, ultimately to the United States and sometimes Canada as well. And if you look at what the administration has done, the Vice President, Kamala Harris, took her first international trip as Vice President to Central America when she traveled to Guatemala last June. And then, of course, she went to Mexico as well. But I think it was very important symbol that she chose Guatemala and Central America to travel to first, showing the importance that she believes that the region has and the importance for development. But the issue is that if you look at what the strategy has been coming out of Washington for regional development, it focuses on new aid, new assistance for working with NGOs and doing things that are necessary from a humanitarian perspective. But my strong message is that we have to do better working together so that we can help develop the business climate across the region that will develop incentives for companies to come and invest and will develop the sort of job creation potential across the region that we're all looking for. And what that means is, from the United States perspective, I would suggest that some of the money that we want to give to the region for development needs to be devoted to competitiveness issues and building a competitiveness agenda in terms of regulatory structures, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of building a cohesive regional economy, customs regulations, all the things that drive regional economies and drive global economies. That's the first thing. Second thing, we need to do better, I believe, to try to work with trade and economic coordination, economic integration to really help the competitiveness agenda for Central America. And I'm going to offer one specific suggestion along those lines in just a moment. But to get to root causes of migration, what one has to do is help create jobs in the formal economy. And so it really is about trade and not aid. So we have to start talking about trade once again and investment. And we have to do more than talk, but actually work together to try to achieve them. Meantime, because of the pandemic that we all know so well, supply chains are shifting globally. They're not necessarily shifting for efficiency purposes, they're shifting for resiliency purposes, right? The COVID pandemic has exposed real problems in supply chains, and many investors and companies are looking to try to create circumstances that will create resiliency in their supply chains. What that mostly means is that companies are looking for alternatives to China. And a natural partner for these shifting supply chains would be the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean that are geographically close to the United States. In particular, of course, Mexico, and also the free trade parties of Central America and the Caribbean, who are also strong democracies. And I emphasize that because that is one area where Nicaragua is going to continue to find itself less and less competitive, as international investors are not going to be interested to invest in a country like Nicaragua that's a full dictatorship at this point. But countries where democracy is healthy, where some of the challenges are coming under control and have access to the US market and are working in a collaborative agenda toward a broader unified regional economy, these are the countries we believe that will be successful in capturing some of this investment that is looking to change in terms of global supply chains. So as you all know, I think Fundesa has done some amazing work in terms of trying to identify some sectors that would be particularly attractive for global investors, and other organizations have as well. But the textile sector, the agriculture sector, high technology, all of these are very relevant and have to be explored. One of the things that I must say as well is that clean energy coming out of the COP26 discussions in Glasgow really needs to be part of this discussion. It's an area where Central America should be very competitive. Unfortunately, the cost of electricity right now in Central America is very high, as you all know, and that makes the region less competitive from a manufacturing perspective. That I believe should be seen as an opportunity, not just to recalibrate the regional electricity grid, but to do so in a very clean and effective and cutting edge manner. And so the last thing that I would say, and I thank you very much for listening to these comments and being willing to engage on these topics, is that some of the countries in Central America, it must be said, are willing to go and able to go further and faster in this competitiveness agenda, perhaps than others. And I would encourage countries who are able to do that to take advantage, because international investors are not waiting. Supply chains are moving. And so countries that are willing and able to move faster will be the ones who will receive the benefit from that, specifically to the extent that it's a possibility to align a country with the provisions of the USMCA trade agreement that the United States, Mexico, and Canada confirmed just last year as the successor to NAFTA. That would immediately make countries more competitive, because they would be at the same level then in terms of their willingness to achieve some of these provisions and to abide by them with the countries of the USMCA. And there's nothing that would be more attractive, I think, to US and North American investors than to recognize that the countries that they are going to be able to be dealing with are those that are seeking the highest international standards and willing to commit themselves to abiding to that. It doesn't have to be a region-wide approach. There are going to be some countries that will be more able and willing to do that sooner than others, but it is something to consider. And even if it can't be done across the entire economy, perhaps there are some sectors that might nonetheless be willing to do that. At the end of the day, global capital is fungible. Global capital seeks its greatest risk-adjusted return. You all know that. Central America has some real challenges. But from that perspective, I believe that in the current moment, with the attention of Washington and North Americans, with the idea that supply chains are shifting, with the new government coming into office shortly in Honduras and some of the other changes going on in the region, there is an opportunity to really begin to refocus on a competitiveness agenda to draw the direct foreign investment that will create the jobs in the formal economy, that will encourage citizens from the region to stay in their own countries, which is a very positive thing, because at the end of the day, the most effective development strategy is to use the human talent that is already in one's country. The United States has been a very great beneficiary of migration from abroad, but we're the ones who gain from that. And the countries who are losing population are the ones who lose talent and in some cases the very best of their population. That's something that we want to help balance out for our mutual benefit, recognizing that these are complicated issues. They are individual decisions, but certainly what we can do from a Washington perspective, working together, is something that I believe we should all aspire to do. So with that, let me conclude those comments again with a thank you for your attention and the opportunity, and apologies for the technology issues that we suffered at the beginning. Thank you for your patience as we got those sorted out. I appreciate it very, very much, and I'll turn it back to the moderator.
Thank you, Eric, for your participation. Incredibly important, given that when it comes to Latin American issues, you are certainly one of the most centered and realistic voices in Washington, D.C. And this event is about recognizing the challenges, but also the opportunities of the Central American region, both in terms of attracting investment, but also in terms of rule of law. So therefore, first of all, I would like to get your sense.
Well, thank you, Leonor. These are important questions. And before I try to answer them, at least briefly, let me apologize to everybody for my lack of facility in Spanish. And thank you for your willingness to do this aspect in English. I appreciate it very much. You are, I believe this is something that I appreciate quite a lot. In answer to your question, yes, there is interest in Central America. Absolutely. The advantages of Central America are, of course, as I mentioned, geographic proximity to the United States, free trade partner with the U.S., a very entrepreneurial and frankly industrious population. People who are willing to work hard and devote themselves to really improving economic circumstances for themselves and their families. And these are very positive things. And so the interest level has been high, in particular given the White House's attention to a new development strategy for the region. But that interest is not going to be sustained, if I can be open and frank about it, unless a couple things happen. First is that the private sector begins to perceive that from the Washington perspective, there is an economic and trade agenda that is part of the overall development discussions. Because if this is an agenda that is primarily one of foreign assistance, USAID, MCC, or U.S. assistance for NGOs, I mean, that's important. Nobody says that's not important. But from a private sector perspective, that's of less interest, right? And so there is a real need for the United States to help support a competitiveness agenda, which the private sector, I believe, will find very convenient because it will help improve some of the investment conditions in Central America itself. So you ask then, what can the regional private sector do to help support that agenda? I think there are several things. First of all is one of the things you're doing right now. That's raising the profile, showing the unity of the private sectors across the region, showing the very seriousness of the work that you're conducting. I think that's a very important point. It shows that the business sector in Central America is a serious and very effective entity across the region. So that's point number one. But point number two, I think that the private sector across the region really has to be advocates for good governance, if I can say, within Central America, advocates for democracy, advocates for regulatory changes that will lead to transparency, that will create broader regional markets, not just individual micro markets within individual countries, but a broader regional consciousness that foreign investors can see, can look at the countries as part of a region, not just as individual countries. I think that the private sector can be very supportive in the context of coming to Washington, frankly, and coming to the United States and being present to be able to convince North Americans that, look, there's nothing like when we meet together to understand better the priorities of each other, but also to take each other's measure. And one of the things that I find very effective is when Central American business leaders travel to Washington, the impression is always the same. Well, these people are really serious. These people are really important. These, they have really good ideas. And the caricature that has been painted of the private sector in Central America is proven to be just that, a caricature, right? And I think we have to recognize that. There are people with other interests that are trying to promote a different vision across Central America. And we have to acknowledge that. And so the more that the Central American private sector can be present and together and promoting a broader regional agenda, I think ultimately that will be a very effective approach. But the last thing I would say, Leonor, if I can, is simply that a focus on the competitiveness agenda is really important, right? Clean energy, infrastructure development, English language capabilities. And it's funny for me to say because my Spanish language isn't great, but it's a reality. But other things like that, which I think can make a very important difference going forward.
Thank you so much for your answer. You actually answered two of my questions in one. The other one has to do a lot with this last thing you said. The private sectors in the Central American region in the last decade have made strides in becoming more sustainable, more inclusive, more fair in the way they conduct business. And yet, the image of the private sector in the U.S., there's still stakeholders and actors that do not acknowledge that. But in that sense, I would like to focus on how can we address better that setback, but also what are other areas of improvement from the private sector so we can become more competitive, particularly in the context of nearshoring.
Yeah, and I think the point you're raising is a very important one. And again, exposure of the reality of the nature of the private sector, next generation, entrepreneurial, very well trained, highly talented, is very important to show the quality of the private sector leaders across the region. And I think, look, let's be honest, there is an impression that corruption in the region is profound and that it is deeply rooted, particularly in the private sector. That's not my view, but that's a view that many people have tried to express. So I think that the private sector acknowledging that needs to recognize that that is a narrative that needs to be shown to be inaccurate. And what that means is that operating in a very open and transparent manner, I think, is obviously very important, and it would be under any circumstances anyway. But to the extent that there are enticements or encouragements toward corruption, whether in terms of dealing with governments or dealing with other private companies or other entities, simply needs to be rejected and exposed. And that's a very difficult thing to do. It's difficult in the United States. It's difficult in other countries around the world. I'm not claiming these are easy things. But if there is an overriding narrative, it has to be combated. Let me give you a specific example. Before I joined the Council of the Americas, I worked in the private sector, and I worked in a consulting group. And one of our clients were the flower growers of Colombia, Azoco Flores, a very good group, doing much important work. But this was a time when Colombia was seen in the United States as a country that was a failing state, where all the private sector was corrupt and was colluding with drug traffickers, and the impression was terrible. We worked very, diligently with Asoco Flores, with the entire flower growing sector, to show that they were not corrupt. They were not working with the drug traffickers. They were not doing things that were contrary to best practices globally. And the people came to Washington month after month after month to expose policymakers to the reality. Eventually, the entire impression changed in Colombia due to the efforts of the Colombian people themselves, of course. But the private sector had a profound influence on that, because despite what the critics were saying, the private sector was able to show very concretely some of the specific things that they were doing that rejected the narrative, that showed it to be false, or that if it was true, it applied to others. It didn't apply to them. I think that's something that the private sector in Central America could replicate, could duplicate, recognizing, again, there is that narrative. And I thank you for raising this question and being so open about that. Because you can't fight something if you don't recognize that it exists. But recognizing that it exists, I think we can work together to show that it's a caricature. The private sector in the region is not like that. And those who are in the private sector who may have some issues along those lines, well, they should be sanctioned. They should have, be subject to, the rule of law, just like they would be in the United States or elsewhere. So I don't know if that's a good answer for you, but that to me is what occurs as you're asking what's one of the main things that could be done to assist in this overall effort. You do have a lot of friends. We want you to succeed. We want Central America to succeed. We need Central America to succeed, both for our own well-being in the United States, economically, politically, because of our historic roots, because of the migration issues, but also because it's the right thing to do. And so to the extent you see things that the United States is doing in the region that is unhelpful, it's also good for you to tell us, right? If the focus of our policy is on this or that or something that's not effective, it's also helpful for the private sector to say, look, we appreciate your help, but you should think about doing it this way. It might have more help too. So be advocates for the region, be advocates for yourselves.
No, thank you so much. And actually, it's a really good answer that reminds us that we don't have to be victims or defined by a narrative. We can change that narrative with our actions and resolution. My last question goes to your last idea about the importance of human capital. The Biden administration developed a new collaborative migration management strategy intended to build a regional framework of safe, orderly, and humane migration from North and Central America. Do you think it will accomplish what it seeks, and what should be our position? We often think that we're going to lose our skilled workers, but what is another perspective that we can take on that as private sector?
Boy, Leonor, you're asking me all of the really easy questions today, aren't you? No, I knew that these were coming, and I appreciate again the ability to engage on these, because these are the right questions. They're not easy, but they're the right ones, and we have to address them. I would say that from my own personal perspective, there will be a temptation to migrate to the United States for the foreseeable future, for the very simple reason that the U.S. economy is large and has jobs available, and has the promise anyway for those who are leaving some societies. And I'm not talking specifically about Central America, I'm talking worldwide, but it also applies to some countries in Central America where the opportunities are not as widely available. So there will always be that natural, or at least for the foreseeable future, that natural pull of differentiation in terms of economies. And that's real. It will occur. But I think what we can do is work together to minimize the impulse, because I have been told many, many times by advocates in the migration community that most people, or at least many people, don't want to leave their communities. They don't want to leave their families and churches and communities and schools and all of these things. And sometimes they just feel there's no alternative. So if an alternative exists, that will naturally reduce some of the temptation to migrate. You ask whether the U.S. strategy will be successful. That's a really tough question to answer. The strategy just changed again today because of the Remain in Mexico policy that has now been reinstituted. and that the Mexican government, as I understand it, has just accepted with some alterations to the way that it was previously. I would foresee that this will be the same sort of strategy that will be pursued now for at least the duration of the pandemic, because the pandemic is really overwhelming everything, including the migration agenda. But at the end of the day, we also have to recognize in the United States that our economy depends on migrants. We have jobs that are going unfilled because we don't have the workforce to be able to fill some of the jobs that exist. And it's critically important for the continued growth of our own economy that we find qualified, talented, entrepreneurial, hardworking individuals who are willing to do these jobs, and to really contribute to the building of the U.S. society as well. And so there has to be some sort of a compromise that can be made in terms of at least guest worker programs. And one of the things that we might think about is working with the Central American countries so that the countries themselves create incentives for people not to try to travel to the United States illegally, or it's a very dangerous trip. It's really a horrible sort of trip, very dangerous. But where the United States recognizes that based on our own needs, we also need workers. And the fact is, if we create some sort of a viable and effective and enforceable guest worker program, then there's the makings of a compromise right there, right? A number of workers come to the United States. Some of the countries in Central America do some additional work on trying to discourage people who are not part of those programs from coming. That's the basis of a compromise. But will it go forward on that basis? I can't say. Simply to note that I think migration pressures will always be with us. And the positive side of that is it means that the United States has a strong economy that is drawing in workers from other countries. The negative side of that is that the economies that are losing their workers are losing their natural patrimony, their natural workforce, their natural talent. And that's something that I think we also have to acknowledge, because development requires talented people in the countries themselves. So, but if I'm invited back at some point to discuss these issues further, clearly these issues will continue to be discussed. We're not going to solve the migration conundrum or puzzle in the immediate future. The best we can do, I think, is working together collaboratively with sovereign countries in Mexico and Central America and the Caribbean and elsewhere, so that we try to do things in the most humane, effective manner possible for our mutual benefit.
Well, that's it on my end, and thank you so much for your participation. It's been really enlightening.
It's my pleasure again. Thank you so much, and best of luck for the rest of your discussions. I mean that sincerely.